The courtroom was silent, except for the heavy breaths of those waiting for the judge's ruling. Marcus Wright, a 28-year-old black man with no prior record, sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes darted nervously toward his mother, who sat a few rows back, clutching a Bible and silently praying for a miracle. The weight of the moment was unbearable, and Marcus could feel the room's oppressive energy pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him. This was about justice, or the lack thereof. Judge Holloway, a stern man with a reputation for being merciless, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. His cold gaze fixed on Marcus as he began to speak. "Marcus Wright," he said, his voice booming across the courtroom, "you stand accused of armed robbery and assault, crimes for which the evidence presented has led this court to one conclusion." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to beg someone to listen. He knew he was innocent. He hadn't even been near the scene of the crime that night. But despite his alibi and the testimony of several witnesses, the prosecution had painted him as guilty with a narrative that stuck. Marcus had quickly learned that in this system, the truth didn't always matter. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "This court sentences you to 60 years in prison." Gasps echoed through the room, followed by sobs from Marcus's mother. Marcus's legs buckled, and he nearly collapsed into his chair. 60 years, his life was effectively over. As the bailiff approached to take him into custody, Marcus turned to his attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who had seemed more interested in clearing his case backlog than fighting for justice. "You said they didn't have enough evidence," Marcus whispered hoarsely. "You said I had a chance." His attorney avoided his gaze. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "The system's not perfect." Marcus was led away in handcuffs, the sound of his mother's cries echoing in his ears. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Marcus felt an overwhelming wave of despair. How had his life come to this? He was a hard-working young man with dreams of one day opening his own business. He had never so much as stolen a candy bar, and now he was being condemned as a violent criminal. Days turned into weeks as Marcus adjusted to life in prison. He found himself in a place that seemed designed to break people, both physically and mentally. The walls were cold and gray, the guards indifferent, and the other inmates, many of whom had their own tragic stories, were often just trying to survive. Marcus tried to keep his head down, but the anger and confusion inside him grew stronger every day. One day, as Marcus was walking through the prison yard, he overheard a group of men talking about a prison outreach program run by a man named Reverend Joseph Carter. The Reverend was known for his tireless work helping inmates uncover new evidence in their cases and advocating for justice. Skeptical but desperate, Marcus decided to write to him, detailing his story and begging for help. Weeks later, Marcus received a reply. Reverend Carter's letter was brief but hopeful. He believed in Marcus's innocence and promised to look into his case. It was the first glimmer of hope Marcus had felt since his sentencing. As the Reverend dug deeper into Marcus's case, what he uncovered was shocking. Evidence that had been overlooked, a witness who had been intimidated into silence, and a prosecutor with a history of questionable ethics. But it wasn't just the flaws in the legal process that shook Reverend Carter. It was what he found about Judge Holloway's past that changed everything. Reverend Carter couldn't believe what he was reading. The more he dug into Judge Holloway's record, the clearer it became that something wasn't right. Over the past decade, the judge had handed down disproportionately harsh sentences to black defendants, often disregarding mitigating evidence or extenuating circumstances. On paper, it looked like a pattern of bias, but to Reverend Carter, it felt deeper than that. It felt intentional. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was systemic, and Marcus Wright was its latest victim. As Reverend Carter pieced together the story, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something explosive. He reached out to an old friend, Lisa Alvarez, a seasoned investigative journalist known for her fearless reporting. Lisa had spent years uncovering corruption and injustice, and she agreed to help. Together, they began to unravel the threads of Marcus's case, starting with the evidence, or lack thereof, that had been used to convict him. The robbery Marcus was accused of had taken place at a convenience store late one night. The store clerk had been injured, and the robber had fled with a small amount of cash. Surveillance footage showed a man wearing a hoodie and a mask, his face obscured. The prosecution had argued that Marcus fit the robber's general description, and had relied heavily on the testimony of a single eyewitness, a man who claimed he saw Marcus running from the scene. But Reverend Carter and Lisa discovered glaring issues with the case. The eyewitness, it turned out, had a history of drug use and arrests. His testimony was shaky at best, and under pressure, he had admitted that he never saw the robber's face clearly. Yet this critical detail had never been brought up during the trial. Why? Lisa suspected the prosecutor had manipulated the narrative to secure a conviction. As they dug deeper, they found more discrepancies. Marcus had an alibi. He had been at a friend's house the night of the robbery, but his friend's testimony had been dismissed as unreliable. There were also no fingerprints, no DNA, no physical evidence tying Marcus to the crime. It was as if the entire case had been built on a foundation of sand, but it had been enough to seal his fate in Judge Holloway's courtroom. Reverend Carter knew this wasn't enough to get Marcus' conviction overturned. They needed something stronger, something irrefutable. That's when they turned their attention to the judge himself. Holloway had always been seen as a tough, no-nonsense figure, but his history suggested a troubling pattern. Lisa began combing through old court records, interviewing people who had appeared before him, and speaking to former clerks who had worked under him. What she found was damning. Several former clerks described Holloway as a man who seemed to relish the power of his position. One clerk, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said he always had this way of looking at certain defendants, like he'd already decided they were guilty before the trial even started. And those defendants? Let's just say they weren't the ones who looked like him. The evidence of Holloway's bias was piling up, but the real breakthrough came when Lisa uncovered an old complaint filed against him. Years earlier, a defense attorney had accused Holloway of colluding with prosecutors to secure convictions. The complaint had been dismissed at the time, but Lisa managed to track down the attorney, a retired man named Gerald Watkins. Watkins was reluctant to talk at first. He had left the legal profession disillusioned and didn't want to reopen old wounds. But when Lisa told him about Marcus, something shifted. "That poor kid," Watkins said, shaking his head. "I've seen it happen too many times. They don't stand a chance in his courtroom." Watkins revealed that Holloway had a long-standing relationship with certain prosecutors, often meeting with them privately during cases. "It's not just bias," Watkins said. "It's corruption. He's protecting his friends, and people like Marcus are paying the price." Reverend Carter and Lisa knew they had to act fast. Marcus had already been in prison for months, and every day he spent there was another day stolen from him. They decided to bring in a legal expert, a young civil rights attorney named Danielle Pierce, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases. Danielle agreed to take the lead on filing a motion to reopen Marcus' case, but she warned them it wouldn't be easy. "The system doesn't like admitting it's wrong," Danielle said. "Even with all this evidence, they're going to fight us every step of the way." Meanwhile, Marcus was trying to hold on to hope, but it wasn't easy. Prison was a harsh and unforgiving place, and he had already seen things he wished he could forget. He tried to keep to himself, but that only made him a target. One day, after a particularly rough encounter in the yard, he sat alone in his cell, staring at the letter Reverend Carter had sent him. It was the only thing keeping him going, the knowledge that someone out there believed in him. When Reverend Carter and Lisa visited Marcus to share what they had found, his reaction was a mix of relief and disbelief. "You mean to tell me they knew I was innocent?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling with anger. "And it still put me away." "It's worse than that," Lisa said gently. "They didn't care if you were innocent. To them, you were just another case to close." Marcus' jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Whatever it takes," he said. "I'm not giving up." As Danielle filed the motion and the team prepared for what they knew would be a long battle, Lisa began drafting an expose on Judge Holloway. She planned to publish it alongside Marcus' story, hoping to shine a light on the broader issue of judicial corruption and racial bias. But as she worked, she received an anonymous tip that sent chills down her spine. A warning to stop digging into Holloway's past. Then, one day, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Andrew, Marcus's cellmate, revealed that he had overheard a conversation in the yard months earlier between two inmates who claimed to know the real robber. According to Andrew, the man responsible for the crime had bragged about how easy it had been to pin it on someone else. The man's name was Darnell Hayes, and he had been transferred to another prison shortly after Marcus's trial. Marcus immediately wrote to Reverend Carter, sharing what Andrew had told him. Carter passed the information to Danielle, who saw it as the missing piece they needed. If they could track down Darnell and get him to talk, it could blow the case wide open. But as Danielle began looking into Darnell's background, she realized they weren't the only ones interested in him. Someone else was trying to keep Darnell quiet, and they were willing to go to great lengths to do so. The fight for justice was becoming more dangerous by the day, and the stakes had never been higher. Danielle's discovery about Darnell Hayes was a fragile thread of hope, but it was also a dangerous one. She quickly realized that finding Darnell wouldn't be straightforward. His name had been scrubbed from public records related to his transfer, and the prison system was stonewalling her requests for information. It was clear someone didn't want him found, which only confirmed that he might hold the key to proving Marcus's innocence. Lisa, frustrated by the lack of progress, decided to leverage her media contacts to dig deeper. She reached out to a reporter friend who specialized in uncovering hidden details within the justice system. With their help, she tracked down a former guard who remembered Darnell. The guard confirmed Darnell had been moved to a maximum security facility in another state, but he also warned Lisa to be careful. "That guy knows things," the guard said. "People want him quiet for a reason." Meanwhile, Reverend Carter focused on keeping the community engaged. He organized a peaceful rally outside the courthouse to bring attention to Marcus's case and the broader issue of judicial corruption. People came from miles around, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus" and "End Corruption Now." The protest drew media coverage, and for the first time, Marcus's story began to gain national attention. But the publicity was a double-edged sword. While it brought more eyes to the case, it also intensified the threats against Lisa, Danielle, and even Reverend Carter. Late one night, Lisa's apartment was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, but her computer, filled with her notes and evidence, had been wiped clean. Lisa was shaken but undeterred. She backed up everything in multiple secure locations and doubled down on her efforts. "If they're this desperate to stop us," she told Danielle, "it means we're getting close." At the same time, Marcus received an ominous warning from a prison guard. "Watch your back, right?" the guard said, leaning in close. "Some people don't want you walking out of here." The message sent chills down Marcus's spine. He had always known the fight for his freedom would be hard, but now it felt like a battle for survival. Danielle, determined to find Darnell, reached out to a private investigator named Jerome Blake. Jerome was known for his ability to track people even when they didn't want to be found. After days of searching, Jerome located Darnell in a high-security prison out west. But getting access to him was another challenge entirely. The warden, citing security concerns, refused to allow Danielle to speak with him. It was clear Darnell was being protected, just not by the people fighting for justice. Lisa decided to use her platform to turn up the heat. She published a scathing article exposing Judge Holloway's financial ties to the law firm and the suspicious pattern of his rulings. The story went viral, and soon the public was demanding an investigation into the judge. Holloway, who had always exuded confidence in his untouchability, suddenly looked rattled. But even as the walls began to close in on him, he fought back, denying all allegations and painting himself as a victim of a smear campaign. The pressure on the team reached a boiling point when Danielle received a call from an anonymous source claiming to have information about Darnell's involvement in the robbery. The source, a former inmate that Darnell had confided in him years ago, admitting he was the one who committed the crime Marcus had been accused of. But the source was hesitant to come forward, fearing retaliation. Danielle begged him to reconsider, explaining how much was at stake, but he hung up before she could convince him. Reverend Carter, sensing the urgency, reached out to his network of clergy and civil rights leaders. Together, they organized a massive march through the city, demanding a full review of Marcus's case. The march drew national attention, with thousands of people showing up to support Marcus and call for an end to judicial corruption. The sight of so many people united for justice brought Marcus a renewed sense of hope, but it also painted a target on Reverend Carter's back. One night after the march, Reverend Carter's car was sideswiped on a quiet road. The driver of the other vehicle fled the scene, leaving Carter shaken but unharmed. It was a clear message: back off. But Carter refused to be intimidated. "If they think fear will stop us," he said during a sermon the following Sunday, "they don't know the strength of our faith or our resolve." Inside the prison, Marcus began hearing whispers about Darnell. Other inmates, aware of the growing attention on the case, started sharing fragments of information. One man claimed to have seen Darnell with the stolen money shortly after the robbery. Another mentioned hearing Darnell boast about how easy it had been to frame someone else. Marcus relayed everything he heard to Danielle, who added it to her growing pile of evidence. As the tension reached its peak, the team realized they were running out of time. Marcus' next appeal hearing was fast approaching, and they needed something definitive to sway the court. Reverend Carter suggested they confront Darnell directly, despite the risks. "We need his confession," Carter said. "It's the only way to break through this wall of lies." Danielle and Jerome devised a plan to get to Darnell, even if it meant bending a few rules. They secured a meeting under false pretenses, posing as legal counsel. When they finally sat across from Darnell in a small, windowless room, the tension was palpable. Darnell's eyes darted nervously as Danielle laid out the evidence against him. "We know you did it," she said firmly, "and we know why you framed Marcus, but this is your chance to make it right." For a moment, it seemed like Darnell might crack. His hands trembled and his voice wavered as he said, "You don't understand what they'll do to me if I talk." But before he could say more, a guard entered the room and abruptly ended the meeting, citing security concerns. As Darnell was led away, he glanced back at Danielle and Jerome, his face a mixture of fear and regret. The team left the prison feeling the weight of defeat, but also the spark of determination. They were closer than ever to the truth, but the forces against them were stronger than they had anticipated. As they regrouped, Reverend Carter reminded them why they had started this fight. "This is bigger than Marcus," he said. "It's about every person who's ever been silenced, every life that's been stolen by a system that doesn't care about justice. We can't stop now." With the appeal hearing just days away, the clock was ticking. The team knew they were walking a razor's edge, but they also knew the truth was within reach. And as the city buzzed with anticipation, one question loomed large. Would justice finally prevail, or would the system once again prove unstoppable? As the appeal hearing approached, the team worked around the clock, desperate to piece together the final fragments of the truth. The mounting pressure weighed heavily on everyone, but none more so than Marcus. In his cell, he clung to the hope that his innocence would finally be proven, even as the odds seemed insurmountable. Danielle, Lisa, Reverend Carter, and Jerome had pushed themselves to the brink, each carrying the weight of their own fears and doubts. But just when it seemed like they had hit a wall, a shocking revelation turned everything on its head. Late one night, Lisa received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. On the other end was a man with a low, gravelly voice who identified himself as a friend. He claimed to have information about Judge Holloway, information that could blow the case wide open. "Meet me at the old train station tomorrow night," he said. "Come alone." Lisa immediately told Danielle, who was skeptical but knew they couldn't afford to ignore any lead. They debated whether Lisa should go, ultimately deciding it was too risky for her to go alone. Jerome offered to accompany her, staying out of sight to ensure her safety. The next night, Lisa arrived at the train station, her nerves on edge. The area was deserted, the faint hum of distant trains the only sound. She spotted a man standing in the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. As she approached, he handed her a small envelope and said, "This is everything you need to take Holloway down. But be careful. If they find out I gave you this, I'm a dead man." Before Lisa could ask any questions, the man disappeared into the night. Back at Danielle's office, they opened the envelope to find a stack of documents, bank statements, emails, and signed agreements, linking Judge Holloway to a secret network of wealthy donors and corporations who had been bribing him for years. But the most damning piece of evidence was a transcript of a conversation between Holloway and a high-ranking prosecutor. In it, they explicitly discussed framing Marcus to ensure a conviction, describing him as an easy scapegoat. The discovery was explosive, but it also raised new questions. Why had this man come forward now? And who else was involved? As they dug deeper into the documents, they realized the corruption extended far beyond Holloway. It implicated multiple judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged from the inside out. But the newfound evidence came with a price. The anonymous source had warned Lisa to be careful, and it didn't take long for the threats to escalate. Her phone buzzed constantly with ominous messages, and a black SUV began tailing her everywhere she went. One evening, as she was leaving the newsroom, someone attempted to run her off the road. She managed to escape unharmed, but the message was clear. Whoever was behind the corruption wasn't going down without a fight. At the same time, Reverend Carter noticed strange cars parked near the church and unfamiliar faces attending services. It was as though they were being watched from every angle. Despite the risks, Carter refused to back down. He continued to rally the community, urging them to stand strong in the face of intimidation. "They want us to be afraid," he told a packed congregation. "But fear won't win this fight. Justice will." Danielle, meanwhile, prepared to use the evidence in Marcus's appeal. But as she reviewed the documents, a troubling thought occurred to her. If the corruption was this widespread, how could she be sure the appellate judges weren't also compromised? The realization sent a chill down her spine. They weren't just fighting for Marcus's freedom. They were fighting against an entire system designed to protect itself. Then, another twist emerged. Marcus received an unexpected visitor in prison, a young lawyer named Ethan Moore, who claimed to have once worked for the law firm tied to Holloway. Ethan confessed that he had been complicit in covering up the judge's crimes, but had recently left the firm after a crisis of conscience. He offered to testify, providing insider knowledge of how the corruption operated. "I can't undo what I've done," Ethan said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I can help you expose the truth." Danielle was initially hesitant to trust Ethan, but his information checked out. He provided critical details that corroborated the documents Lisa had received, painting a chilling picture of a system that had sacrificed countless innocent lives for the sake of power and profit. But Ethan's testimony came with a catch. He demanded complete anonymity until he could safely leave the country. It was a risky proposition, but Danielle agreed, knowing his knowledge could be the key to finally freeing Marcus. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the team faced a daunting decision. Should they go public with the evidence before the appeal, risking retaliation and potentially compromising their case? Or should they hold off, focusing solely on Marcus and tackling the broader corruption later? Each option carried significant risks, and time was running out. Just when they thought things couldn't get more complicated, another bombshell dropped. Reverend Carter received an anonymous letter containing a single sentence: "Not everyone on your team can be trusted." The message sent shockwaves through the group, sowing seeds of doubt and suspicion. Who had sent it? And was it true? With so much at stake, the possibility of betrayal was a devastating blow. As the appeal hearing drew closer, the tension reached a fever pitch. The team was more determined than ever to see justice served, but they were also painfully aware of the powerful forces working against them. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight for Marcus's freedom was about to reach its most dangerous stage yet. The day of the appeal hearing arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with tension. The steps were crowded with supporters holding signs for Marcus, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation, every seat in the gallery occupied. Danielle sat at the defense table, her files meticulously organized, while Marcus, clad in an orange jumpsuit, sat beside her. His face was calm, but his hands trembled slightly, betraying his nerves. Reverend Carter was in the front row, his presence a source of strength for everyone involved. The hearing began with the prosecution's attempt to dismiss the new evidence as irrelevant and speculative, but Danielle was ready. With a steady voice, she presented the damning documents, carefully walking the court through the chain of corruption that linked Judge Holloway to Marcus' wrongful conviction. She called Ethan Moore as a surprise witness, and his testimony sent shockwaves through the room. Ethan detailed how evidence had been fabricated and witnesses coerced, his words a scathing indictment of the system. As Ethan spoke, Judge Holloway, presiding over the hearing, grew visibly uncomfortable. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, and he occasionally interrupted, trying to redirect the focus. But Danielle was relentless, countering every objection with precision. The courtroom was riveted, the weight of the truth bearing down on everyone present. Then, just as it seemed like the tide was turning in Marcus's favor, the unexpected happened. The prosecution introduced a last-minute witness, a man claiming to have seen Marcus at the scene of the crime. The gallery erupted in murmurs as the man took the stand, his calm demeanor and detailed account threatening to undo everything Danielle and her team had worked for. For a moment, Marcus's heart sank. It felt like the system had pulled a final cruel trick to keep him behind bars. But Danielle wasn't about to let that happen. She requested a brief recess and quickly huddled with her team. Lisa, scanning through their files, noticed something odd about the new witness's testimony. His timeline didn't match the original police reports. They had caught him in a lie, one that could expose the prosecution's desperation to maintain their case. Armed with this information, Danielle returned to the courtroom, her confidence renewed. She cross-examined the witness with surgical precision, forcing him to admit discrepancies in his story. Then, as the tension peaked, she revealed the final piece of evidence, a recording provided by their anonymous source. The audio captured a conversation between the prosecution and the witness, coaching him on what to say. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the recording played, the sound of voices colluding to maintain a lie echoing off the walls. Judge Holloway banged his gavel, his face pale. The crowd in the gallery erupted again, this time with gasps and shouts of disbelief. Reverend Carter closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, his hands clasped tightly. Marcus' expression was a mix of relief and disbelief, the weight of years of injustice beginning to lift. But just as victory seemed within reach, the the final twist arrived. As Danielle prepared to deliver her closing statement, a commotion broke out in the back of the courtroom. The man who had given Lisa the envelope of evidence burst through the doors, yelling, "They're coming for me. You don't understand. It's bigger than Holloway." Before anyone could stop him, he handed Danielle a USB drive and was quickly escorted out by security. His words hung in the air, cryptic and ominous. Danielle hesitated for only a moment before inserting the drive into her laptop. Projecting its contents onto the courtroom screen, she revealed a list of names, judges, prosecutors, and officials, far more extensive than they had imagined. The corruption wasn't confined to Marcus' case or even Holloway. It was a sprawling network that had manipulated justice across the entire state. The revelation stunned the room, leaving everyone grappling with the sheer scale of the betrayal. The appellate judges, visibly shaken, called for an immediate recess to review the evidence. Hours later, they returned with their decision. Marcus' conviction was overturned. The gallery erupted in cheers, tears streaming down the faces of those who had fought so hard for his freedom. Marcus stood, his legs trembling as the bailiff unlocked his cuffs. He turned to Danielle, whispering, "Thank you," his voice choked with emotion. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse a free man, the crowd outside erupted in celebration. But the victory was bittersweet. The USB drive's contents made it clear that the fight wasn't over. Danielle, Lisa, Reverend Carter, and the rest of the team knew they had exposed only the tip of the iceberg. There were more battles to be fought, more lives to save. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, addressing the crowd with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I'm free today because of people who refuse to give up," he said. "But there are others still trapped in the system. We can't stop now." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the courthouse, Danielle and Lisa exchanged a glance. They had won a battle, but the war for justice was far from over. And as they turned to join the celebration, the faint hum of danger lingered in the air, a reminder that the truth, though powerful, always comes at a cost.